let's look at another technique on how to memorize long passages. We have looked at how to use colors previously. Now, if we want to look at passages with conversations, we'll be looking at whenever the stories has a huge part of conversation. Basically, you would want to draw it out, having a square or rectangle for the background information and ending information, and relating conversations between two persons. So today we'll be looking at the story of the rich man and Lazarus from Luke chapter 16. Altogether, there are 13 verses from verse 19 to verse 31 from the parable itself. So it's a lot of words, and sometimes it can be very scary. It can be too much, but let me show you that you can actually memorize this when you put it into pictures or into drawings form like this. So first thing we notice is that there is a conversation in the second part. All right, the first person is the rich man, and the rich man is talking to Abraham. You notice that there's a first conversation here, a second conversation, and the third part. They are talking back and forth to one another 3 times, and there is some information that's being given about the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus. So there's only 1 in 4. There's nothing at the end. The parable ended when Abraham finished his what he said. Okay, so for this we would like to put it into this particular format. The background at the very beginning, and then the first conversation, the second, and the third. So this conversation has 3 parts to it. So I want you to download this paper, print it in an A4 form, or you can draw it for yourself in your notebook. Okay, so you either use this by printing, or you write it out as we go along. So as we go through later on, I want you to just fill it in, all the information, because writing is helpful to memorize. Okay, if you don't write, you will not remember. Let's move on. Okay, so now the first thing is that we notice the background. We notice that the rich man has 2 information explaining him. Number 1, he's dressed in the most expensive clothing. Number 2, he lived in great luxury every day. Okay, 2 things. Whereas in comparison or in contrast, Lazarus, 4 things being mentioned about him. Number 1, he's covered with sores. Can you imagine the pain? All right. And he was brought to the rich man's door. So basically, he's sitting there and he's begging for food from the rich man. He hopes that the food that fell off the table can be enough sustenance for him. So basically, he's hoping to eat the food from the rich man's table. Okay. And number 4, even dogs would come and lick his sores. Mind you, these are Jews, so I think there's a footnote there. Take a read. It's haram for them, for dogs, and it's something that is terrible. So this description shows how depraved, how difficult, how susah Lazarus is, all his sufferings. Okay, 4 things. And then suddenly both died. Okay, at their death there is a shift. The rich man was enjoying and then now suffering. The Lazarus was suffering and now enjoying. So you will look at the shift. The rich man died and now he was buried where? In Hades, where he was in great pain. It's not just doing nothing there, but he was in Hades and he was in great pain. So 2 things, write that down. Lazarus as well, 2 things. He died and was carried by the angels where he sit beside Abraham. For the Jews, this is heaven. Okay, they sometimes call Abraham's bosom to describe heaven. So sit beside Abraham basically means that Lazarus is in heaven. He is at the feast, not just in heaven, he is enjoying. Okay, he is feasting in heaven. And a new information was given. He looked up, referring to the rich man. The rich man looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus at his side. With this, we will begin our conversation. Now, the first part. In the first part of their conversation, the rich man said three things. The first thing was, Father Abraham, take pity on me. You can imagine while he was alive, the poor man, Lazarus, would have said the same thing. Oh, rich man, take pity on me. And now the rich man said, take pity on me, Father Abraham. Send Lazarus to dip his finger, not much, just a little bit. Dip his finger in some water so that he can cool my tongue, because I am in great pain in this fire. So three things. And in response, Father Abraham said four things. Remember, my son, that in your lifetime you were given all the good things while Lazarus got all the bad things. Very similar to what was told in the early part on the information when they were still alive. This is a summary. You had, in all your life, you had all the good things. Lazarus got all the bad things. Number two, there's a contrast. There's a change. The balik now. But now he is enjoying himself while you are in pain. Number three and four is talking about the deep pit between them. So there's a deep pit so that those who want to come from here to you cannot, and you also cannot come to us. Nobody can cross this deep pit. Four things, write it down in your worksheet, in your paper. So the first part of the conversation is spoken against the covetousness of the Pharisees. It shows the awful fate of a rich man living in selfish, this is the point, right? Selfish pleasure. Pleasure and luxury is not wrong, but selfish pleasure and luxury with disregard of the poor. This is not a good stewardship of the wealth that God has given. Therefore, this is spoken against greed, spoken against covetousness, but very specifically against the covetousness of Pharisees. Because if you go back a few verses, this is in verse 19, if you go back a few verses, all this rich man in contrast with the poor is spoken because few verses before in verse 14, right? The rich man and Lazarus start in verse 19. Verse 14, it says that the Pharisees sneered at Jesus because they loved money. So Jesus began to tell these tell this parable in response to these Pharisees, to their actions, that they are sneering, that they are laughing because how much they are covetous, how greedy they are for money. And therefore, this is spoken against them, okay? The first thing is pinpointing at their greed, their lack of stewardship, okay? And therefore, the punishment. But the second part of the conversation is slightly different. The rich man said, I beg you, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to where? My father's house, where I have 5 brothers. Send them back. Tell the Jews, tell the Pharisees, warn them so that they would not come to this place of pain. It sounds like a very good suggestion, isn't it? But let's see what Father Abraham said. Father Abraham said, your brothers already have the prophets and Moses to warn them. They already have this warning. They have the law of Moses, they have the writing of prophets. They should listen to what they say. So the second point is this, that they have already received warnings. They have received warnings from the book of the law of Moses. They have received the warnings from the writings of the prophets. In other words, Scripture has already given ample warning. They should listen from the law, from the prophets. And then you look back again a few verses in verse 16, Jesus actually mentioned the law of Moses and the writing of prophets, that it is still in effect. You should listen to it. To the Pharisees. The Pharisees are people who teach the law of Moses. The Pharisees are people who interpret the writings of the prophets. But Jesus is telling them, don't just teach it, apply it, listen to it, obey it. Okay, so the first thing is against their greed, their covetousness. The second thing is you should obey. You should listen. The things that you teach, you yourself should be a good stewards of it. All right, so number one, against the covetousness of the Pharisees and the fearful punishment. Number two is against the warning that has been given from the law of Moses and the writings of the prophets. Now the third part of the conversation, the rich man says, this is not enough, he says. Is the law of Moses not enough? Is the writings of the prophets not enough? He says this, but if someone were to rise from death, talking about Lazarus, he says if Lazarus would rise from death, they would repent, they would turn from their sins, and they would believe. But Father Abraham said, no, if they did not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone were to rise from death. This one gave us a hint. Jesus gave a hint and prophecy that they would not believe even when Jesus himself rose from the dead. When Jesus rose from the dead, later on, they didn't believe. So in this parable, it shows that no, you know what? You said that if someone were to rise from death, they would believe, they would repent. But the reality is no. Jesus rose from death. Even then, they did not believe. And therefore, if they didn't believe to the law of Moses and the writings of prophets, they will not listen, even when Jesus is to rise again. Okay? So this is the summary of it. The first one is the covetousness of the Pharisees. The second one is they should listen to the warnings that they have received, Moses and the prophets. Number three, they would not believe. Then if Jesus were to rise from the dead, they would still not believe. Okay, so write it in, try to memorize it, pause the video, because right after this, I want you to give yourself a test, all right? Give yourself a test and rewrite this entire story from verse 19 to verse 31. Are you ready? Let's play it right now. This is the question from SPM in the year 28. It says, relate the parable of the Lazarus and the rich man. There are 13 marks. Take out a piece of paper, either in your notebook or a foolscap paper. Give yourself 15 minutes, pause the video, time yourself, and then play it back. I'll go through the answers with you right after this. Okay, welcome back. Now we're gonna look at the answers. Take out your red pen. I want you to mark your own paper. Let's have a look. Verse 19 says, there was a rich man, here no mark because it's in the question, who dressed in the most expensive clothes and lived in great luxury every day. Do you have this? Give yourself a tick. If you have something along these lines, give yourself a tick. Basically, this man lived in extravagance. Okay, you can say that this rich man lived an extravagant lifestyle every day. You can give yourself a tick as well. Okay, next, there was a poor man named Lazarus, no mark there because it's from the question. He's covered with sores, give that a mark. And then he is brought to the rich man's door, hoping to eat the bits of food that fell from the rich man's table. You can give yourself a mark there. If you say that every day he came to beg from the rich man, you can give yourself a mark there as well. Okay, and then next, the dogs would come and lick his sores. This is very interesting because I told you just now, for the Jews, the dogs are haram, they are unclean. And how terrible, how much suffering this man is going through. Okay, give yourself a mark there. And the poor man died, and here is the mark. he was carried by the angels to sit beside Abraham at a feast in heaven. Give yourself a mark. If you have simplified it, he was taken to heaven and enjoying himself. You can get a mark as well. The rich man died and was buried, and in Hades, where he was in great pain. So if it says the rich man died and he was suffering in hell, you can get a mark as well. And then next, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus at his side. Give yourself a mark there. If you have rephrased it and says he saw Lazarus beside Abraham, you can get a mark as well. Next, in verse 24, he said, Father Abraham, take pity on me and send Lazarus to dip his finger in some water and cool my tongue, because I am in great pain in this fire. Now, if you have said, ask Lazarus to help me, give me something, a little bit of water to quench my thirst, you can give yourself a mark as well, okay? So you notice that the marks are given not word by word, but it's the point, it's the idea. Because I'm in great pain in this fire, there's no mark given because it was already mentioned just now. Here, I think, here, okay, where he was in great pain, we already given a mark here, okay? Verse 25, Abraham said, remember my son, no mark, that in your lifetime you were given all the good things while Lazarus got all the bad things. So just mention, you can swap it around. Lazarus suffered, but you have enjoyed good things in life. You can still get the same mark. But, okay, now the contrast, but he is enjoying himself here while you are in pain. Give yourself another mark. And next, there is a great pit, or if you have written a great pit, you can give yourself a mark. If not, if you have the explanation that those who want to cross over from here to you cannot, those who want to cross over to us from where you are also cannot. So you can be slightly different. Those who want to go over cannot. Those who want to come from your side to my side also cannot. Basically, however you explain, that says that nobody can cross. Even if you say there's a deep pit and nobody can cross over this deep pit to the other side, you can give yourself a mark as well. Verse 27, the rich man said, I beg you, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to my father's house where I have 5 brothers. Give yourself a mark there. If you say, send Lazarus to tell this news to my brothers, you can give yourself a mark as well. Let him go and warn them so that they at least will not come to this place of pain. If you have said the sentence just now, you most probably would have lost this mark or the mark previously. You notice that there are 2 parts of the mark. The first is send Lazarus to my father's house and tell my brothers. That's 1 mark. The second mark is about warning them so that they will not go to hell, okay? So that's the second mark. So you have to search for it, try to see the difference in the sentence. There are 2 parts of it. Going on, Abraham said, your brothers have Moses and the prophets. Listen to them. So that's 1 mark. So if you say that they should listen to the prophets and Moses, you get the same mark, okay? Excuse me. In verse 30, the rich man answered, that's not enough, Father Abraham, but if someone were to rise from death and go to them, then they would turn from their sins. 1 mark. Okay, talking about rising from the death. But Abraham said, if they would not listen to Moses and the prophets, they would not be convinced, even if someone were to rise from the death. 1 mark. Altogether, there are 16 marks. Can you check how many marks you have? Give it a count. And then, no matter if you get 16, 15, or 14, you will still get a maximum of 13 marks. Now, if you have gotten the conversations mixed up, for example, the first, second, and third conversation, you got the order mixed up. For example, you write the second one first, then the first, then the third. You have gotten it in wrong order. At the total marks that you have, give yourself a -1. So if you got 16, -1 becomes 15. So 15, you still get max 13. If you got 15, -1, 14, 14, you still get a max 13, all right? But if you get 13 -1 for order, you get 12 marks. So you get a 12 marks, okay? Now, how many marks did you get? I think you should at least have gotten 8 marks and above. Now, try again, hopefully, so that you can get a 13 marks, okay? Memorize it and try it again. Hope that you can get a better score, okay? So you can play back this marking scheme later on. However, for the sake of practice, I would like you to do this one. Instead of the SPM 28, which gave 13 marks, I would like you to give yourself 16 marks out of a total of 20 marks given. I'll show you where the 20 marks are. It's very similar to the previous one. The difference is this. I want you to give yourself for Hades. The rich man died and was buried, and in Hades, if you got the word Hades or hell, give yourself 1 mark. Where he was in great pain, give yourself another mark, okay? Therefore, if you have later on, I am in great pain in this fire, give, if not given above, in verse 23. If you didn't manage to get this mark, then in verse 23, you missed this mark, right? You lost this mark. Then in verse 24, you should give yourself 1 mark. If you have received the previous mark, then you don't get a double mark here, okay? And then I want you to add 1 more mark here. In deep pit, if there is a big gap or there's a huge part that separates us, whatever that means deep pit, give yourself another mark. And then the explanation that nobody can cross over from this side to the other side, give yourself another mark. So an extra mark for the deep pit. And lastly, in verse 29, if you have the words Moses and prophets, give 1 mark, okay? 1 mark for both the words Moses and prophets. And then in verse 31, they repeated Moses and prophets. If you have received verse 29, this mark, then no mark here. But if you lost this mark, give yourself mark in this part of verse 31. The last mark is found here. So this is not enough. Basically, the idea where the rich man says, Moses, prophets, not enough, okay? So however you say, you can say that they will not believe Moses and prophets. It is not good enough. They need more than that. They need more than Moses and prophets. All this idea is the same. Give yourself 1 mark. So altogether, there's 4 extra marks. That's why you get 20 in total and maximum 16, okay? So use this marking scheme for practice so that you will get 16 marks instead. I think this is a better way to prepare for this story. Okay, so work hard. I wish you all the best in your revision for your SPM. God bless you and have a great revision time.